Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another exciting edition of the ATACS podcast. I am your host today. I am Flex from Raleigh, North Carolina. It is October 16th, I believe, 2020. I am joined by a panel of experts here today. Joining me is Nate from Clayton, North Carolina. How's it going, Nate?
It's going all right. Congratulations on getting the date correct.
I don't have it in front of me, so I was going off the top of my head.
It's here. It's correct. October 16th.
Thank you for double checking me. Also joining me is Will from, I'm going to say Greenville, North Carolina. I don't know where you're actually at right now, but we're going with Greenville. How's it going, Will?
Who knows where I am? I don't even know where I am. It's crazy, weird pandemic season.
Yeah.
So, who knows? I would also like to congratulate you on getting the day correct. It's a difficult thing these days.
It really is.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be, but it is.
Yeah.
So we are convening here today to talk about The Last of Us Part 2.
Really trying to get away from the whole pandemic thing.
Yes. Talk about a game.
If we lean into it, we'll come out the other side.
And we should state up front, all of us have finished the game. This is a deep dive discussion about The Last of Us 2, so there will be spoilers. It's a no holds barred discussion. So if you care about not hearing spoilers, this is your one and only warning. Leave now, because we're going to go all in. And with that out of the way, I guess we will get to it. This game came out some months ago, but we have now all gotten through it, and we are going to start our discussion just kind of with a broad overview of how we feel kind of about the general stealth action, let's say. Because this is, mechanically speaking, I would call it a stealth action game. You get a lot of sneaking around, hiding in tall grass, crawling around, sneaking up behind dudes and stabbing them in the neck with your knife or your shiv, whatever it may be, and dragging them back into the grass. Or no, do you actually move bodies around in this? I can't remember.
It's weird because you can drag them around while you're holding them, but once you stab them, they're just going to stay wherever you stabbed them.
Right.
You can only move live bodies.
Yeah, you can only move living, breathing people, not once they've been impaled.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like I have memory of like getting bodies out of the way, but then I couldn't. As I played this game pretty close to when it came out, and
yeah,
I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, once you shiv them real good, they don't move.
So I'm just going to go ahead and say up front, I quite enjoyed the stealth action in this game. I thought it was pretty good. I don't feel like Naughty Dog's games in general are like always necessarily the best feeling controlling games, but I think, and I've played most of their games after the first Uncharted. I think this game is pretty easily the best feeling game I've played from them. And I enjoyed broadly just kind of the setup of the encounters, the kind of scenarios they had, kind of working my way through those environments was generally pretty fun. I think there was a lot of good hiding spots, a lot of nooks and crannies to crawl through. I enjoyed kind of the tools at your disposal, just kind of from that broad standpoint. I thought the action felt good, and I, despite the length of the game, didn't really get tired of it throughout the length. And I think they did a decent job of kind of mixing things up as it went along, and we'll get into some of those specifics maybe a little bit later. But I think it stayed fresh, and so I guess from a super broad level, like to say I enjoyed the stealth action. And how did you guys feel about the stealth action part of this game overall? I guess we'll start with you, Nate. What did you think about it?
I think I'm a little mixed on it. not that I dislike any parts of it, probably, but I mostly think like the basic controls, the fundamentals, like you said, the array of tools and weapons that you have are all really good. I don't think that I don't know, I think I came away from it fairly unimpressed with the encounter, the builds of the encounters and like enemy variety. I didn't really feel strongly that was that engaging throughout. But I don't know. I mean, what did you think, Will? Did you find the like general, like from one encounter to the next, sort of repeating this loop of like exploring, scavenging, and then hitting an encounter that was either going to be against a bunch of dudes with guns or a bunch of fungus zombies? Like I guess I felt like between those encounters there was not a ton of variety.
Yeah, I can certainly agree with that. I think it is a type of thing that I like. It's a loop that I like.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of scrounging, fighting, exploring. I really like worlds like this. These sort of post-apocalyptic, overgrown types of things.
Right.
I think these are all fun, and I guess in terms of gameplay, I wanted to kind of point out a couple things. One thing that I wanted to point out was the interactive map in Seattle. I
Mm-hmm.
thought that was a really cool little touch. When you found a note that referenced something directly, it would circle the location on the map, and then after you explored the map, it would cross it out so you knew
Yeah.
you'd kind of done with that. I
But
also,
it wasn't all like traditional video game menu stuff. Like it felt very organic and tied in well. I think it is a good thing to point out.
yeah, yeah, but I enjoyed generally, like I said, the scrounging, the combat. I actually at one point I started the game on normal because I'm a bit of a wuss. But after a while, I actually found I was like, I've got too much stuff,
Yeah.
and I kept running into these situations where like I would have to like craft things to actually pick other things up. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, this is telling me something. So I kicked it up and I found that ended up making things go a lot smoother,
Yeah.
or at least a lot. I think it kicked up the tension a little bit and just made the game more engaging. Um, Things that I wasn't a huge fan of, I was not, I don't know, I understand the rationale for putting the dogs in, but I just didn't feel like the tools I was given were particularly effective at dealing with the dogs.
Yeah.
Like, I think some people really liked, I heard, well, get your bow out and headshot the dogs with the bow. And that sounds great in theory, but it just never happened for me. Basically, if there was a dog around, I would basically just, okay, it's time to go loud for a minute while I
Yeah.
make sure I handle this dog. And then we'll just see if I can mop up the rest or hide again or something like that. It just never seemed like, I don't know, and maybe this is a William problem, but I wasn't able to evolve my tactics in a way that really made those encounters any smoother throughout the whole game. It was just dog
No.
encounters were just rough.
The dogs are definitely the biggest wrench that they throw into the game in terms of mechanics. Like
Mhm.
when they put a dog in an encounter, you just cannot play the normal way at all.
Right.
Like I kind of enjoyed that disruption though, because it's like it forced you, like
Mm-hmm.
that was the wrench. It was like, oh crap, there's a dog. Like I really gotta be on my game here. Like
Especially if you, like me, are trying to not kill the dogs.
that would make the game very hard. I usually did one of two things. It was either just aggressively go for the dog right up front, which usually involved what Will said of just getting it with an arrow right out the gate.
Mm-hmm.
Or I would hang back and find its path and put a proximity mine. I forget what they were called, but the bombs Ellie can make.
Yeah.
Put one of those in the dog's path, and it would usually get both the dog and the person walking with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I found that a very effective way to take care of dogs.
That sounds pretty good. I think if you can kind of get in there on the path and then kind of get out of there before you're spotted. I like the general upgrades, while we're talking a little bit about those trip mines, and of course there are upgrades that upgrade your trip mines and everything like that. But I did find, of course, a lot of the upgrades were just sort of, let me enhance this thing you already have. Kind of like, here's your Molotov's going to be bigger. Now you can craft an extra trap bomb. Now you can see a little bit further with your detective mode, so to speak. Those are okay. And I always, and I have to call attention to this in our Last of Us podcast, I love random expired medications giving me my upgrades. It's just
it's
excellent.
so dumb.
It's excellent. Just take a handful of expired, oxycodone and Vicodin and anti-anxiety, and you just have superpowers. You know what I mean? It's excellent.
I can see through walls.
One thing I found myself very, very much relying on were the melee weapons and the upgraded melee weapons. To me, those were almost heads and shoulders better than pretty much any other offensive tool I had. Because I felt like, if some guy got near me or spotted me, and he would close the distance, and then I would just pop out and hit that melee attack, and it would, of course, throw me into some sort of prearranged melee attack, like a scripted melee attack that was just really devastating. On the other hand, I haven't talked to anyone who used the smoke bombs more than like once, maybe. Yeah. I don't know if anyone knows anyone who used those smoke bombs. I don't even think I ever was in a situation where I was looking at my inventory and I was like, oh, what would really help me get out of here? Is a smoke bomb. But
and there were some skills where you could make like a ton of smoke bombs too. Like there were definitely skill trees that seemed focused on that.
Did you use them?
No, not really.
Yeah. So
the skill trees, I agree with, I forget which one you said. I agree that like the skill trees weren't really that exciting.
They weren't to me at all.
Yeah, I do think that was something I would have wanted. Both your skills that you use the pills for and also your gun upgrades, I think were mostly pretty standard. The skill trees did have a little bit of like, you can't get everything, so you have to pick and choose like, ooh, do I want the thing that lets me make more trap mines or more smoke bombs, which obviously trap mines there. Come on.
But I would definitely go very long stretches and then be like, oh yeah, I should probably spin these pills I have, and then pull up the upgrade menu and be like, oh yeah, I wasn't doing it because I just don't feel like I care about any of this, and I would just pick something random.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you that in some ways some of the encounters were could be considered repetitive, but I also think it kind of depends on how much the lore grabs you and how much the locations grab you. Because I think, off the top of my head, we've got four of the things that and we can talk about these later, but Fowler and I, Flex, Major Mitch, whatever we want to call him, he is, we both really love that skyscraper encounter. That giant apartment building as you're going down, or the giant hotel, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it. There's also a bank that I thought had like a really interesting environmental story about a guy getting like stuck in the vault. And then the radio station I thought was a really neat environment. And I also like the ship that Abby spent some time on later in the game. So even though you're kind of fighting some similar enemies, I just thought some of the environments were really cleverly designed and interesting. So I guess I didn't really get hit with that sort of sense of repetition.
Yeah, and when I said up front that I thought the game did a good job at kind of keeping things fresh, that's a lot of what I was thinking about. Is I think the different set pieces, it's, to be fair, it's all fairly subtle differences, because yes, the enemy set in this game doesn't change a ton. But the environments often impose various restrictions or like different ways you have to move around, and then they kind of give you different permutations of the enemies, because you probably have like on the order of like half a dozen different human type enemies in those encounters, and then maybe a little less than that on the infected variety. So you're probably somewhere in the 10 or a little more in terms of enemy types. In the game.
Something like that.
And they kind of have permutations of those throughout the game, but I think a lot of what made, I think more than that, what made the encounters stand out to me is more of what Will's saying of just like the different set piece design. I think the first half of the game was a little weaker on that to me. Like I think the first half of the game had a lot of, you're just in Seattle in kind of those outdoor city environments, and
you're either just on a ruined city street or in just kind of a mostly nondescript abandoned building for a lot of that first half.
Yeah,
but you're right that the I think the second half does have some stronger, like, cool locations that feel different, even if the enemy variety isn't necessarily changing a lot.
Yeah, I do think in the first half, one of the standouts, and maybe we'll talk about this later, but the first time you encounter the Seraphites and you're in the forest, and they have a whole different way of fighting, and I think that was an interesting shakeup that they leveraged fairly well.
Yeah, the whistling before it gets irritating because you just hear it so much, and it's almost like the first time you see them, there's that element of, who are these guys? And wow, I just got shot and this takes forever to pull this arrow out of my shoulder. But after a while, you're like, okay, I know what they're doing. Oh, okay, listen, here we go, whistle. And they've got the different whistles for like, whoops, I just saw him, and like, better get him, and he's there. And it's kind of interesting, but at the same time, I was kind of like, okay, here we go again, these guys.
I wonder. I'm curious how many like takes and like whistling actors they had, because like to me those whistles are like super distinctive and like weirdly menacing. They're like so frantic when they see you that it's really effective at conveying.
I think those whistles are amazing.
Conveying something. So like just the fact that those like whistle sounds are so impactful and effective, I think is just like a tiny microcosm of like just the sheer production value behind this game.
Yeah, I think some of the other locations I want to call attention to. One is, of course, the Sky Bridge, which I thought was just a really, really conceptually cool thing, which is an Abbey section. And I also liked Ellie's speedboat section when she was, I guess it's a speedboat. I don't know what you want to call it. When she's actually like kind of going around in the little, the little boat with the motor. I thought that was kind of neat. But I mean, aside from that, I think the most important thing we probably need to cover as far as gameplay is the trading cards. With the superheroes, I think we really need to take some time and break this down because it's ridiculously stupid. And
who is your favorite superhero trading card, Will?
I think I probably read the first one, and I can't even remember what it was.
Yeah,
I know that there was one that was designed. I think Kotaku said something about there being one that was designed after Neil Druckmann. So who knows? Maybe that's my favorite.
I got and read that one, and they wrote him like he was an evil villain subjugating his subjects to harsh work conditions. Like they leaned into that a little bit, or I don't know if that was intentional or not, but there was definitely a way to read that card that way.
Interesting.
Yeah. One note about the whistles that was funny to me is I always play games with subtitles on. So you would get subtitles that would say like alert whistle.
Whistle.
Or like I forget what the other titles were, but they would like kind of tell you what the whistle was signifying, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which I thought was amusing. A couple random like mechanical notes that I had written down. One thing I thought the game did pretty well, or at least it caught me off guard more than once, is one example of this I can think of is the first time you encounter those enemies that like scurry around and you can't detect in the detective mode. Do you know what I'm talking about? But this isn't specifically about those enemies, but like something this game I feel did multiple times is like almost this horror thing of like you look at a spot, you clear a spot, you think it's good, you turn around to interact with something, and then you turn back around and something has changed. Because I remember like clearing a room of those guys, then going off into a side room and like scrounging and collecting some stuff. And I turned back around, and at the end of the hall, one of those enemies like scurries by, and like just kind of producing that tension and making it feel like, because like at least for me, I'm used to in video games thinking like, oh, cleared this area, it's good. Don't have to worry about it. But I feel like they did a kind of an interesting job of like making areas feel more alive than that. And just because you cleared it, it's not safe.
Yeah, those guys had a very specific AI pattern to evoke that feeling of like you're being watched in the dark kind of thing, and it does work. Where they'll literally, they don't run at you, they'll run around you using side paths, and then they'll like hide behind cover specifically that blocks your sight from them, and then when your camera pans over them, they'll like dash out ladder like perpendicular to your vision to like specifically freak you out, but they're not really attacking you. They will eventually circle around you and try to attack you from behind. So then you get those jump scares too of them suddenly appearing out of nowhere.
Yeah. And there was another they really they had a whole different way you had to approach them. Then there was another instance where it's like some side apartment complex or something just off the beaten path. You go explore and start scrounging, and like you go through this whole building and there's nobody in there. And at the end there was a workbench, and interacted with a bunch of workbenches up into that point in the game. But you interact with this one, and while you're interacting with it, like going through menus trying to select to upgrade a gun, a human enemy like comes and grabs you from behind. So it's like just those kind of things of like areas that you normally, or like spots you normally think of being safe in games, they kind of throw some stuff at you, which I thought was interesting. Yeah,
that was a really cool moment. I remember that. It really like made me startle.
Yeah. Another random or another little note I had is the the safes kind of cracked me up in a way of like, that seemed very unrealistic that there were just safes everywhere, because I don't know how often y'all see safes in real life. But also, did y'all figure out that you could like just listen to the clicks on the dials?
No, I had no idea you could do that.
I had to go find all the codes.
Yeah, that's what I did.
At some point, like halfway through the game, I noticed that when you get to the correct number, there's like the click sounds different. So you can actually just like slowly spin around and like listen for the audio cue.
That's very funny.
Yeah.
Way to break the game. Come on.
And another, I guess this kind of banks off what Will was saying with the production values when we were talking about the whistles. This game as a whole obviously is like super high production values, and just some of the like even very minor things, like when you're in the workbench, like upgrading guns or doing stuff, like just the elaborateness of the animations of either Ellie or Abby, like, manipulating the guns and doing the upgrades is just like, man, they put so much work into this thing.
Yeah, they'll just like pop out the magazine and take the slide off the top of the gun and like pull out this brush to brush the muzzle out and oil it up. It's pretty intense.
Yeah. One thing I do want to give a shout out is I think their difficulty sliders are really neat.
I was going to bring that up too.
Yeah, like it's even way more nuanced than just like easy, normal, hard, or whatever the modes were called. Because like within each one, there's probably like half a dozen different metrics of like, supply ammo scarcity, or like enemy how much damage they deal to you, how much damage they can take, like their health. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but it's like these kind of
AI aggressiveness was one, and you could change both enemy AI aggressiveness and your allies' AI aggressiveness.
Oh wow! Yeah.
To make it easier or harder on both fronts.
So I thought I always like it when games put some thought into their difficulty options, and like having all of those different factors on sliders that you could adjust individually, I think was really neat, and something I'd like to see in more games personally.
I really enjoyed having the AI aggressiveness all the way up on my playthrough. So they were just murdering fools anytime you have a partner in that game.
Yeah, to clarify, this is your partner AI.
Yeah. Sometimes in the game you have one partner AI character with you, and they can't die. Well, I guess they probably can, but then they were never in danger for me.
Yeah, I don't know
that I can remember. But yeah, they would just run around killing everything if I.
Hilarious. I actually, the AI companions got me caught more than once. Like in the first Last of Us, you played as Joel and Ellie was your constant companion, and she was like basically invisible and would always just like move out of the way really quickly. But like,
I feel like that usually was the case in this game, but you had specific instances where they got caught.
Yeah, I had specific instances where there were two different things that happened. The very rare one was instances where I'm pretty sure the enemies just saw my companion sitting in the open, and the enemies noticed it, and it was triggered, and like we broke cover because my companion was sitting in the open. But that was pretty rare. The thing that happened more often is there was like only one safe space of cover, and my companion got on it before I got to it, and like I was banking on being able to hide in that cover, but because of the like collision detection with your companions, I couldn't actually get on that spot, and that caused the enemy to see me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's very funny.
That happened to me all the time, and it was infuriating.
It's like, no, I was here first.
Don't get out of the
way. You don't matter. You're an AI.
Yeah, so I guess, if anyone else has any other mechanical shout outs, feel free to give them. The last thing I was going to ask question wise is like, did anyone kind of have any kind of general favorite weapons, favorite tactics? Like what was kind of your go-to plays, if that makes sense, if anyone wants to share that. And if you don't really have anything to share there, that's fine too.
Well, I think, with Ellie, she's got the actual knife, so I think as much as possible, I was always just trying to stealth kill everything, and then of course, if I was spotted, a lot of times I would pull back to cover and then pull out whatever upgraded crazy melee weapon I had, and then wait till some guy, once you can see any part of his body poking around the corner, you can hit the button to start the melee attack animation. And generally, of course, that was just like an insta slam.
Yeah.
I guess I also, and then, the rest of the guns to me were not interchangeable, but nothing really stuck out a ton to me. I mean, I used a lot of shotgun if I had it. But otherwise, I think that was kind of my go-to. And then, of course, Abby, it was a little bit more. She ended up getting a lot of ammo for that assault rifle. So there were certainly some encounters where I just went all assault rifle. You had to do the shivs to actually deal with some of the baddies with the melee with her. So, like if you got in touch with a clicker, you'd have to craft some shivs. So, of course, I went that direction. But yeah, I would imagine the guy who was able to discern it sounds like you guys had a much more sophisticated way of playing the game. I think Nate was telling me about the AI pattern of the guys and what they're doing, and Major Mitch over here figured out that we can turn the safes until they click, and I'm over here like, I'm gonna wait till they get here and I'll hit them with my big axe, and that was where I was at. So I don't know.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, did y'all try and stay stealthy most of the time, or did you ever just go loud? Or I tried to stay stealthy both with Ellie and Abby. I tried to stay stealthy as long as I could, especially with Ellie. For most of her chunk, I got through most encounters by maintaining stealth until close to the end of the encounter, if not the entire encounter. I felt like her abilities, I could do a pretty good job of just like kind of skirting the perimeter, picking off guards as I could, and then kind of working my way inward and just always hiding bodies and picking them off, and which I found satisfying in that stealth game way of just, like picking people off. Abby, I definitely went in went in loud more often because they give her more tools to just go in and bust things up. But I still tried to play stealth as much as I could.
I would agree. I tried to do the stealth as much as I could. There were certainly some encounters that got really messy, where I would like run around behind some bush and go prone and like, don't look at me, you know, or something like that, or just like, I don't know, back up a long way and then pop a guy, and then, you know, it got a little messy. But there were certainly some where, you know, I take the whole encounter out without having to get spotted, and of course that always feels, you know, delicious. What a delicious pile of murder.
Mm-hmm. So I think I had a little bit different approach to parts of this game than you guys. So I definitely started out doing stealth almost exclusively as much as I could with Ellie, because I think the game very heavily incentivizes you to do that. If you get into open firefights, you're going to waste resources that you just don't need to spend if you just stealth and reload if somebody sees you. And then I got bored of that.
Did you reload a lot?
I did early on, because I was just like, man, I shouldn't have gotten seen there, and then I would reload. And it usually would only take you back like a few seconds.
Yeah, so I do kind of want to point out that the auto-saving and reload times for this game by like PlayStation 4, Xbox One era console standards was incredible, because
it's insane.
I'm used to load times being absolutely terrible on those consoles.
The initial load into the game is super long, but then once you're in the game, loading checkpoints and stuff is super fast.
Yeah, I don't know how they pulled that off. It's wild.
I don't either. So yeah, I mean, that's another way. It's just, you have no reason to not just keep reloading and stealthing your way through encounters, because then you never have to use any bullets. But I got kind of bored of that. So probably like halfway through Ellie's section, I just was like, you know what? I've got full on everything and I never spend any of this stuff. I'm just going to start killing people. Yeah. And one of the sections I did that in was one of the sections with the like hidey zombies that just run around you. Mm-hmm. And I was like, man, I don't like this. They're trying to get me to stealth through this horror section. I've got this machete. And I'm sprinting through there and just macheteing those guys if they jump in front of me. And then I was like, you can kind of just run through things and you don't even necessarily have to fight everybody. And then it was a lot of me like just like trying to just get the jump on groups of guys and just like throw Molotovs everywhere and then shoot a couple and then just run. Or if there was a dog in an encounter, I would just be like, nah, I'm good, and just like run past the whole encounter and just not fight any of them.
One thing I did think was really cool is that if you got past an area without killing everyone, like that's fine. Like
it was totally fine.
Yeah, which I think's neat.
Yeah.
I think there is a certain satisfaction to, from time to time, just completely doing something opposite of the way that the game wants you to do it.
Yeah, it's kind of funny.
At the beginning, I think I had this real cynical approach when I started this game. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, especially when it started, you know, it was like showing me all its little beautiful graphics, and it was hitting me with like cutscene after cutscene after cutscene after cutscene. And then they put me in the little snowball fight at the very beginning, and I just stood there. The whole snowball fight, I just stood still and just got creamed by all the little snowballs. I'm like, I'm not doing this. And and then Dina was like, come on, we're gonna lose. And I just stood there and got hit in the head over and over with the snowballs. I was like so annoyed at it. I was like, I don't want to do a snowball fight game.
Oh, that's great.
I'm not having your fun.
Funny. But for me, like, I ended up not engaging with the general stealth combat encounters past a certain point. Like, I enjoyed it fine, but at past a certain point, I started having just more fun by just like just blowing everything up or just running past an encounter that I just was like, nah, I'm good. I want to get to the next story beat. Because like by that point where I was like a third or half the way through the game, I was just like, I'm way more interested in these characters and seeing the different locations than I am with fighting this group of 10 zombies. So like I'm just gonna do it as fast as I can and not worry about it. And I was playing on normal, so it didn't really like bite me in the butt later or anything.
Right. Yeah. So I played it on hard, and I also got to points where it's like, oh, I have too much stuff. Like that was kind of my, like, I would go loud every now and then if like I was just completely stocked on resources. But in general, I felt like hard to me, or the difficulty I played on felt like a good balance to where I still felt just enough tension that I wanted to try and stay in stealth as much as possible. But I felt like, as someone who sometimes likes stealth action games and sometimes doesn't, I feel like, at least for me, this game did a good job of that balance of, I enjoyed the stealth when I stayed in stealth, and the vast majority of the time when I broke stealth, it also felt fine. Like I would go, start going loud, and that was fun to me as well. It didn't, like, I did reload some. Like if I got caught, like seen like right at the beginning of an encounter or something, I would usually reload. But like if I got like, I don't know, a third or a half of the way through encounter and things got loud, I'd be like, all right, no, I'll roll with it. And I played most of the game that way, of like trying to not reload and just kind of going with the flow, if that makes sense. And I think the game somehow made that balance feel good, if that makes sense.
I think sometimes it's like the game, I don't even know if you call it reloading, but listening to you talk about it really did bring back to mind for me. Like some guy would like walk close to me, he'd like sneak up right beside me, and I'd pull out like the hunting pistol or like the hunting rifle or something, and I'd try to just like pop him in the head, and I'd like miss him, and then he's like, "Hey, she's over here," and then I'd like shoot again and miss him. And then he's like, "Hey!" And then they start running at me, and I'd miss like 2 more times. And then I was like, "Man, fuck it!" And I just like step out and get myself blown away, just because, like, it's so quick to reload. So I don't know if you call that a reload, but I did that.
It's like basically the same thing.
Yeah, at the very beginning of the encounter, if I just like totally screwed it up royally, there were times where I would just like run right into a guy. I'm like, "Take me down," or whatever. But
yeah, for sure. But I do think to your point that I think that it does do a good job of supporting those different approaches or different styles of play. Like you can play it 100% stealthy, and I think it works for that. The fundamentals are good enough that if you're enjoying that, then it will work. Or you could go loud, and I think it would probably work. You'd be low on resources at parts, but it would work. And if you want to save scum your way through and do it all perfect and get all headshots, it's easy to do that because it is easy to save and load very quickly.
Yeah, I think it's like we often think about AAA games like kind of jack of all trades, master of none a lot, and you could maybe argue that this game does that to some degree. But I think what stood out to me about the stealth action is that, kind of what you just said is like all of it felt good. They kind of, however you wanted to approach it, like to me, it just felt like a good, well-rounded, competent, well-playing stealth action game. And especially by not, like I said up top, I think it's, to me, the best playing game Naughty Dog that I've played from them.
I will say I never got tired of just bare knuckle brawling fungus zombies and just ducking and weaving and punching them in the face.
Yeah,
I can agree with that.
It never gets old.
I think
especially Abby,
I would agree with Flex that that is definitely the best playing game Naughty Dog's produced. But I think also this is the type of genre, like this sort of third person stealth action, that and really, I guess a lot of third person action is just not really done in the indie space. There's just, I think I go searching out games like this a lot of times, and I know that, Flex, you and I played Origami, but other than that, I don't even know that I've ever really seen a decent indie treatment of stealth, that third person stealth action like this. So I think it's almost like you have to go into the AAA space to really get an experience like this. It feels like to me.
Yeah. And I mentioned I don't necessarily play a ton of these games, but for my money, I think this is one of the better stealth action games I've ever played. Like, I think, and that's kind of like, we often think of Naughty Dog games as like, oh, the story's the important part, the gameplay is whatever, but like, that's kind of why I wanted to talk about the gameplays, because like I think like by actions, like stealth action standards, like I think they made a genuinely good stealth action game, and I think that's not to be dismissed. But with that, unless anyone else has anything to talk about on that front, this probably is worth getting to the narrative side of things, because there's a whole lot of that here to talk about. We had kind of amongst ourselves, we're definitely not going to walk through every single plot point of this game, but we kind of talked about amongst ourselves beforehand of maybe kind of talking about it in 4 different chunks. Nate was the one who proposed the chunks. So what is, in your mind, Nate, what is the first chunk of this game? How do you define that?
I would define it as an extended prologue that is everything before Seattle.
Okay, so that involves the little bits we get as Ellie in Jackson. Was that the name of the town?
Yeah.
And also a bit with we actually play as Abby for a little bit in that section as well.
Yeah, so you get to play as both of the main protagonists of the game, protagonists / antagonists.
Which one's which?
They're both, right?
Yeah. Just clarifying. But
in the Jackson area, which is the jumping off point for the main events of the game, which basically starts with Abby and her crew, which are all new characters that weren't in the first game, showing up outside of Jackson to hunt down Joel and kill him for what he did in the first game.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ellie, the part you play as her, is her sort of witnessing this happen. So my question for you guys is, when you're playing as Abby at the start of the game, they're pretty vague with what Abby and her crew is doing, which I knew because I read spoilers before I played this game. So I'm curious how that came across, like jumping into the sequel and then being like, there are all these new characters, they're doing something, but they're not telling the player what. And then coming to that realization very quickly as they meet Joel and his brother and then turn on them and kill Joel. Well, what was that experience like?
Yeah. I think, for me at least, I had heard that, the story was very controversial. I don't think I didn't play it on release. I think actually a friend of mine played it through the whole thing. And of course it's like a 30-hour game or something, or, it's pretty long, and then let me borrow it. And then I played through it. And so by that time, of course, there were all kinds of takes all over the internet. And, I did my very best not to get spoiled. Of course, I heard the poor passing of Mr. Joel, but otherwise, I didn't really know anything about it. So I guess in my mind, I guess I didn't go into it with many expectations, and I guess I felt like whatever expectations I had were designed to be kind of subverted.
Yeah. And
so I think I didn't put too much stock in that Abby section. I'm like, okay, well, here we are with her. I just sort of like doing that. Yeah. I think the things that I guess I'll turn that over to Flex to see what he had to say about it.
Oh yeah, so I didn't play it immediately on release, but I played it pretty quickly, and I was pretty good about avoiding spoilers. So I did go into it pretty blind. I did not know when I switched to playing as Abby. I did not know what she was after.
Right.
So I get the question you're asking of like, they don't really tell you what Abby's after.
Yeah.
I pieced it together myself somewhere in the middle of her section that like, I think she's going to try and kill Joel. And that was partially informed by it. A number of things fed into me kind of deducing that. One was, even while I had avoided spoilers, I knew there were big controversial things that happened in the plot.
Yes.
And that just makes sense as something that would be controversial of killing off Joel.
Yeah, honestly, when this game was first announced, I feel like the most obvious prediction you could make is that Joel's going to die.
Yeah. So
probably early on.
Yeah. So even without being spoiled, that just seemed like a fairly likely thing to happen.
Yeah.
So there was that. Also, Naughty Dog has, especially in their more recent games like Uncharted 4 and Last of Us 1, I feel like this is part of their house storytelling style, is that they don't explicitly explain, they don't do backstory in the way that most video games over-explain things. Naughty Dog almost takes it the other direction and under-explains things and wants you to pick up on facial cues and subtle acting moments, and they rely more on that. And I think I, at some point during that, was kind of able to pick up just from mannerisms or dialogue or whatever that like she's out for revenge, and picked up it was, and pieced together it was Joel.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know for sure until it happened, but like I had a pretty
that would
good
make sense.
feeling.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the mentality I had going through it, of like, at first I didn't really know what was going on, but like I pretty reasonably pieced it together, I think, during that Abby section, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Which is an interesting way to go about it, because like, yeah, they don't explicitly say it for a good while. Like what's going on? Like you introduce these new characters and you're even playing as them and don't even know what their goals are. You just kind of, at some point you kind of have to be along for the ride a little bit. And then, and maybe because I've played enough Naughty Dog games, I kind of knew those gaps would be filled in along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of got on board with up front, like, okay, I don't know exactly what's going on here right now, but we'll get to it, I'm sure.
Yeah, I with respect to this first section, I guess the extended prologue, I guess the main things I wanted to kind of call attention to were, one, of course, the voice acting, I think is really pretty exceptional, and the mocap stuff. There were some really fantastic, I guess the most memorable parts of the first section to me were some of these dad moments where there's all this tension, of course, between Joel and Ellie, and he's trying to have some sort of conversation with her. And, he's really, really giving it his all, really trying to get her to kind of come around, or to get her to like flash him a smile, or to like sort of relax around him a bit, but it's kind of not really working, and I thought some of those were kind of true to life, kind of real in a certain way. But yeah, that first section was a lot of little cuts. Now you're playing with this person. Now you're playing with that person. You're doing this thing for just a second. Here's another big ass cut scene. So, I don't know that it was probably. I mean, it was probably necessary, but it certainly was not my favorite part of the game. Was that prologue?
Yeah, you saying that, like, did y'all feel like the prologue was effective at setting up the core? Like, I guess it was set up to like explain why Ellie was going on her big revenge quest. Like, do you think it was effective at that? Was it too long? Was it, I don't know, like, did that work for you? And combined with that, before Will said what he just said, my main question that I was going to ask was, did Joel's death impact either of you in any way? Because I think for me, I kind of saw it coming, and also Joel's kind of an asshole anyway, who's also killed a lot of people himself. So it was like, in some ways, it was like, oh, it's just kind of another death in this world that sees a lot of death. And also with kind of seeing it coming, I don't think it had the emotional impact on me that maybe they were going for. But I'm curious what you guys felt from that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I certainly don't feel like it really had much of an impact on me in terms of Joel himself dying. Although there was a part of me that was like, Abby, he just saved your life. Like they
Mm-hmm.
come by and pick her up and put her on the horse and just complete, like,
Yep.
I mean, that would have been it. And then she immediately is like, back to business.
Yep.
So
I do think that was effective at showing like just how intent Abby was on killing him. Is
Right.
like, even though he saved her life, she was like, no, we're still doing this.
And
Yeah.
everyone I've talked to, all the people that I know really that played the first game, were all sort of the opinion that, what are you doing, Joel? This is an idiotic decision. But then there are certainly people out there in the sort of critical sphere, the critical gaming sphere or whatever, who really kind of related to that decision and really were like, oh, great. So glad they both made it out alive, and it just, I guess for me, that's an interesting piece of it. Cause I do wonder if there were people who it hit, in some way that were like, so, and I think I do remember seeing like just little casual takes over on Reddit and stuff where people were like, I hated playing as Abby. Why would I want to play as her? She killed Joel. And it's like, oh, okay, buddy.
I think there are a lot of people who have an attachment to Joel, and that moment like really hit him in the gut in a way. Go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, especially I remember when the story leaked for this game before it came out, the predominant internet opinion was, how could they kill Joel and then make us play as the character that killed him, which I think is stupid, but people were legitimately mad about that, so I guess they're entitled to have their emotion.
Yeah. So when I heard that there was a lot of controversy around the story after the spoilers came out, I thought they were, and then when I started playing the game and they had that section where you play as Abby early on, I'm like that to me was pretty clear foreshadowing that playing as Abby was going to be a substantial part of the game. So my thought was they were going to kill Ellie, and possibly Joel as well, like potentially both of them, and you just play most of the game as Abby. Like I was thinking there would be like a really big, like you would maybe only be playing Ellie for like the first 3 hours or something, and the rest of the game would be Abby. And because Ellie died,
wouldn't that have been a choice to have the sequel to their super successful character-based narrative game be this lady rolls in and murders all the characters from the first game?
Like I seriously thought, like, because the reaction was so strong, like before the game even came out, like I thought it was going to have to be on that level, but this feels weird saying they only killed Joel, like that it was.
But that's right. I mean, it's the most predictable death that you could have guessed, and like I understand that people might have had an emotional attachment to him as a character, but I certainly didn't, and so it just wasn't a big deal to me.
Yeah, like to me, if they hadn't killed Joel, if they it almost wouldn't have made sense in that world to have a whole nother game and not have an impactful death like that. Like there's so much death in that world, and what kind of story are you telling that doesn't involve? I don't know. It would feel at odds with kind of the world they've portrayed, and I don't even know what the story would be motivated by at that point.
Yeah, I don't know what the sequel would be without some event of that level, for sure.
Yeah, I do want to talk more about something Will touched on with Joel trying to be a dad to Ellie, but I kind of want to save that conversation till later after we cover some other points in the game, because they do like a lot of flashbacks and stuff. Like despite Joel dying early on, he still appears in the game a lot.
Yeah.
This might be a good spot to go ahead and move on to kind of the next chunk of the game. But before that, I do want to take a quick break. So we're going to do that. We're going to pause for a minute, take a quick break, and then we will be back to discuss the rest of the game. Stick with us, and we'll be back soon. Welcome. We are back to this ATACS episode on The Last of Us Part 2. I am Flex, joined by Nate and Will, and we're going to keep talking on all sorts of detail about Last of Us Part 2. So we just finished talking a little bit about the kind of the prologue area, and in the next big chunk of the game, you're playing as Abby, working your way through Seattle. Ellie, sorry. I'm with it this evening. Yes, you're playing as Ellie,
Yes.
moving through Seattle, and you're on the hunt for Abby because Abby killed Joel. And like that's pretty much the real driving force. I mean, the narrative doesn't really change until the very end of this section. Like you're on the hunt for Abby, and there are a couple of set pieces, and there's a couple other characters who play big roles as well. And I might almost say narratively, this section for me is probably defined by the growing relationship between Ellie and Dina, who's your companion through most of this section. Would y'all agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the sort of exploration and discovery of the factions in Seattle was a big part of that section, as well as like learning about what happened in Seattle since it was a quarantine zone, and the rise of the WLF and the Seraphites and all that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think for me, I tend to default to looking at the more personal story of The Last of Us, both parts 1 and 2, but this game actually does, especially during this first part, does a pretty good job at kind of laying out the broader landscape of what's happened in Seattle since the outbreak, where you had I forget what the initial army was called.
Fedra.
Yes, Fedra. You had Fedra kind of like becoming more controlling and authoritarian as the outbreak got worse and time went on, and then the WLF or the Wolves kind of rose up and like overthrew them, but then they in turn become too controlling. It's like you trade one evil for another, so to speak.
They became the thing that they fought against. Like, turns out controlling a population of people in extremely difficult times means either you're not going to really have control or you become fascists.
Yeah. Which I think is an important, like, while a lot of the story is fairly personally focused, I think that backdrop is very important in kind of setting the tone and in some ways the game's philosophy as a whole, maybe.
And they roll it out very well. I felt like, at least, where it was not a bunch of huge info dumps. It was very deliberate, like, exploration of little bits at a time that gave enough context to where you could start putting the pieces together before it gave you the next level of information. Like, they did a good job, despite the fact that the factions are like Fedra and the WLF, of like distinguishing the two such that it wasn't confusing, even though they're both military like organizations in control of Seattle at different times. Like, you could easily see in a different game, especially if you think about like very anime JRPGs or something, where they just like give you the 7-minute cutscene at the beginning, just like giving the backstory of Fedra and the WLF, and you're just like, this doesn't make any sense. I don't know what they're talking about. And then throw you in the game, and it doesn't matter. Like, this game layers that stuff in a very good way, in a very effective way.
Yeah, and then it goes back a little bit to what I was saying earlier about Naughty Dog's storytelling style is a lot of like not over explaining things. And I think in the world building sense that works out really well, like you're saying, of you kind of keep peeling back the layers of all of that. So I'm not quite sure until the very end of this section, I'm not sure what y'all want to focus on. I think there's a lot of character building between Ellie and Dina, like I said, but I don't know how much of that's necessarily worth digging into other than to say they obviously become very close, developing a romantic relationship, and also just how much they rely on each other to stay alive in this world.
I think one thing that might be interesting to kind of ask you guys is, what were your thoughts on, because there's a number of flashback scenes in the game where you go back as Ellie and you're visiting the hospital. One time you go back as Ellie and you're visiting like a dinosaur museum. One time you go back as Abby and there's a zebra, I think, that got caught in some barbed wire. So I guess, did you guys enjoy those scenes? I think there was a part of me that once I got in my little scrounging loop, it was almost like, ugh, nothing I find in here is I won't be able to keep anything I find in here, and they probably won't have anything for me to scrounge in here. Although I did really like the birthday present, and I think that was in this section where Ellie and Joel takes Ellie to like a air and space museum, and they hop in this like lunar capsule or something, and he gets her to put a helmet on, and you kind of feel her imagination as she's in space.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of a touching moment.
Yeah, some of those scenes are really endearing.
Yeah, I think that that scene in particular, I think as a whole, the flashbacks, this gets into one of my larger theses of the game, I guess. But as a whole, the flashbacks, I think, are a really important part of this game's story. I totally agree with Will that mechanically they always like pulled me out of my focused zone, and it was like, oh, what are we doing here? Like, I need to get back to the flow I was in before this. But I think narratively they're really important to especially understanding Ellie's character. Abby gets a couple flashbacks as well, and I don't think they're as important, but I think the Ellie's flashbacks with Joel are very critical. And a lot of people have pointed to the one in the museum in particular as like, oh, this is like what we were looking for, like the Ellie Joel relationship that we loved so much in the first game. Like that's what we were wanting. Like that's, I don't know if I'm understanding other players incorrectly, but I kind of got the sense and seeing the reaction of that scene that like that's a lot of what people liked about in the first game. And they kind of pinned that moment to see like, oh, this is like the good Last of Us. This is what we wanted more of.
Yeah.
But I pushed back on that a little bit because my memory of the first game was not a lot of happy, good feelings between Joel and Ellie. Like my memory of their relationship was more of out of necessity kind of feeling. Like it wasn't that they really wanted to. I mean, obviously some fondness grew over time, but Joel was just doing a job at first. And for most of that game, that's what it was. And Ellie also didn't always trust him either. But I think also importantly to this game, the whole flashbacks, and I forget exactly when the pivotal ones occur, but like we see very clear. So, the first game ends with that whole cliffhanger of like, or maybe not cliffhanger, but like some ambiguity of like where their relationship ends. Like, does Ellie trust, like Joel straight up lies to Ellie on what he did. Does Ellie trust him? Like, there's definitely a lot of tension in that relationship. And we see simultaneously through these flashbacks, we see them having those moments of closeness, like in the museum, but we also see Ellie still questioning him a lot. Like there's multiple points in those flashbacks. She questions like, hey, are you being straight with me? So she clearly doesn't believe him or she wouldn't keep asking it. So she keeps asking him like, hey, did you tell me the full truth? And eventually she gets the full truth from him. And that really strains their relationship after that point. This is, of course, after the museum section. But I think all of these flashbacks in total are really important, I think, to show, to me, it speaks a lot to how defining, how important Joel's relationship was to her character. And even though they clearly had a lot of ups and downs, and like they had some very positive moments like in the museum, and they had some very negative moments like when the truth finally comes out and Ellie is super pissed. To me, it drilled home how entwined their lives had become and how they affected each other in that way. So I think, to me, that drilled home a lot of when Joel was removed from her life, even if they didn't always have the best relationship, like she didn't know how to process that at all. And also because Joel was this murdering psychopath as well, like seeing all those flashbacks also kind of drilled home to me that, like, oh, Ellie's father figure for a long time has been this murdering psychopath, and now she's turning into a murderous psychopath. Like, it kind of drilled home, like, how she has learned to engage with the world has been primarily through Joel. And, you know, his actions in The Last of Us 1, like, she saw those actions. When she got the truth from him, she realized what he had done. Like, she learned a lot of how to interact with this world through Joel. And I think when she, and this is my read of it, when she loses Joel, she doesn't know how else to handle it. Like, all she knows in this world is murder, basically.
I do think that is probably the right reading of Ellie through this game, is just like basically completely broken. She's lost her the most important person in her life, the person that anchored her a little bit and gave her some direction. But I think if that's the 100% intended read, I almost think outside of like connecting those dots from these flashbacks, I almost think they're a little too subtle on that for a large portion of the game, where she has a very loving relationship with Dina and has like moments where she still seems aloof and like a kid and like she could live a happy, normal life and be a well-adjusted person. And I think those moments probably, like, even though they're not the pivotal moments that we see her like slipping away or see what she's lost, like, I feel like those moments for me end up like weirdly outweighing, because it's just kind of her personality, which was like, her personality was so firmly established in the first game as this like goofy kid.
Yes.
And then when they continue that on, but then we're also kind of getting this subtext that like, no, actually she's completely broken and like has lost her grip on humanity. But those two don't really mesh in a way for me that made it to where, like, I agree that I think that is the intended story here. And I don't necessarily think they nail it throughout because of her like moment to moment character interactions and the way she acts like when things aren't going on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I agree with that. I think in my opinion, the biggest storytelling, I think this game does a lot of things well with its storytelling, but I think it definitely has faults as well. And I think its biggest fault is that, they don't, because in my personal read of this game, Ellie is a completely broken person who does not know how to engage with the world or engage with other people at all. Like, I think even at the end of the game, the way she treats Dina is like, just, she is totally broken in her human interactions.
And I would say that I didn't fully like accept that was her state through the game until that end section, which we'll get to. And
I mean, she's been through a lot. Like, it's understandable that she would have mental trauma.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, especially in the first Last of Us, her personality is established as this, like, I don't know, plucky, witty, charming kid.
Right.
and I think the flashbacks could have done. I think they do this to a degree. They did it. I think they do it like just enough that if you're paying close attention, you can kind of get this. But I think the flashbacks are kind of meant to serve as kind of showing through her, formative teenage years, how she goes from that, I would say fairly happy kid given the circumstances to someone who's completely lost their grip on, their humanity, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they maybe don't. I don't think they connect that thread as well as they could have.
Yeah, which is to be fair to them, like a really hard thing to do. But there are, I think there is enough of a gap there that I think it could be considered a problem of the storytelling in this game.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it didn't really affect my enjoyment of the story, but it was there for me when I was thinking about it after I finished it, like.
Mm-hmm.
That I couldn't really mesh her actions throughout the game with what it felt like the game was trying to say she had become.
Yeah. And that is part of the subtle Naughty Dog style, right, is to not beat you over the head with these things. But I think in this case, they probably went too subtle.
Yeah, and I think I still probably would prefer them to be too subtle than to be so over the top that it would be annoying on that stuff. But that was kind of where I landed on her development.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to jump in here at any point, Will, or if you have any thoughts on the whole kind of Ellie arc, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah, I guess to me, I felt like we, in the flashback pieces, and I don't know the best time to really bring this up because I feel like there's a section like this in pretty much every piece of the game. The last time that the game sent me to that hospital, I was so over it. I was like, oh my God, we're back here again.
Yeah.
And then you walk, and then, you run into the room, and then whoever it is, Ellie or Abby's like, and then you run down the hall, and then this door's closed. And I felt like I went to the hospital like 6 times during the game or something like that. And I was like, oh my God. Yeah, I know it was pivotal. It was very pivotal, but I'm over it. And I guess to me, I'll hold off on some of my thoughts on the Ellie piece maybe until we get to that section.
Yeah.
The one last thing I do want to say about this first Ellie section is I think, and this is, I think, lends itself a little bit to your point, Flex. The murder of the girl who is playing Hotline Miami on her Vita.
Oh yeah.
I think in some ways, of course, that's just like a funny little nod. But I also think there's some of the most memorable aspects of Hotline Miami are this whole, do you like hurting other people? And, the fact that it's almost like this hyper stylized murder, and I think it's a very interesting inclusion. I think a lot of people said, I think even, Jim Sterling had mentioned about this game. He said, I know that you want to get across the point that murder and violence is bad, but it undermines your point when it's this fun, and I think that's an interesting thing to think about in light of, in light of the little Hotline Miami reference, which is this very hyper stylized, violence glorifying game, but I don't know. That was just something I wanted to mention about this section because I think that was part of this particular piece.
Yeah, there's definitely a big conversation you can have about like what is the game's commentary on violence and how does that interact with what the game does to encourage and reward you for doing violence. And I think where I generally come down on that is like whether you feel like the game is directing criticisms of violence at the player or not, if that makes sense. So like some games will give you the option to do something violent and then like wag their finger at you if you do it as the player. But I don't think that's what The Last of Us really does. I think it portrays characters in a world with motivations, and they happen to be very violent motivations. and that
It's just a
and then
violent world in general.
and then they display that as a negative thing, but it's not really in your control whether you're going to do violence or not.
Yeah, I think it's definitely not in your control, but I do think that there are some things you do. I mean, the most tragic and stark one, of course, is the double murder in the aquarium.
Yes.
And I think as you gain more and more of an understanding of who those characters are, what their history is, the types of things that they're dealing with, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's very possible to not feel, well, of course I couldn't have known that, and the game made me do this, and of course that's a valid take, but I don't think it would be completely out of the question for somebody to feel a little bit of remorse about what they quote unquote had done,
Yeah, I always read these things as like it's a linear story driven game with events that are going to happen regardless, and like I think I always approach those as like, no, this is just the story of the game, and like I never read that as like the finger wagging towards the player that Nate was talking about.
I think they dipped towards it a couple times.
Yeah,
to me, with the like going back to the next section we're about to probably start talking about in a minute, which is when you switch to Abby and you see all the people and places that you've been like tearing your way through as Ellie, and they try to like make you feel bad about some of that stuff. I think they dip towards it in that
there's
section.
A section, Flex, where as soon as you start with Abby, and I don't know, I guess maybe we can make our official transition, unless there's anything you guys wanted to add.
There's one other thing I wanted to...
Okay, all right, we'll do that.
Yeah. No, the transition is super important. I think that's one of the other big themes in this game is like the showing both sides aspect.
Yeah.
But one thing I want to hit on, and does tie into this conversation, is I actually think more than the double murder in the aquarium, I think the murder of, I think her name's Nora.
Yeah, that one is equally harrowing.
Yeah, and that one I think is, to me, when they probably try and push those buttons the most, because of the way they set the scene where they turn the camera back on Ellie, which is you as the player. So they're like, that's one of the few moments where they are directly looking at Ellie's face, and like that's all you're focused on.
And they force you to push the button.
Yes, as they force you to push the button. Like that's, to me, is actually the scene that feels most overtly like, hey, look at your face, you are doing this bad thing.
Yeah, right. I guess the scene, and I'm not really giving away much about the transition, but the scene that immediately came to mind for me was at one point after Abby gets done with the first part of kind of the introduction to the compound, I think whoever the doctor is takes her into this back room, and it's absolutely chock full of body bags. Mm-hmm. And she says, these have been coming in hot and heavy. I don't know what's going on out there. Mm-hmm. And it's just, it's really morbid, I mean, and you did that.
Ellie or to the Seraphites? I don't remember.
I thought it was a reference kind of to Ellie, or at least that's how I read it. But maybe
I don't know that they specify.
Yeah, they don't specify. But of course,
there is a big war between the wolves and the Seraphites going on, and I think.
Well, I thought that there was sort of a ceasefire at the time. But
I think the timeline is pretty fuzzy on that. But I feel like things are fully engaged at that point. But I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, I don't know, but anyway, when I played it,
you could read it that way.
When I played it, I saw in those body bags all the dudes that I'd been murdering, but I don't know, that might be inaccurate. I don't
know. No, you might be right, and I don't know the exact specifics on that. I'll tell you the one thing that they really tried to push buttons on at the start of the Abby section, and you guys may not have noticed this, but I sure did, is that the dog you encounter as Ellie. Mm-hmm. Shows up, and his handler's like, all right, Bear, let's go sweep this area. And then when you hours and hours later switch to Abby, they're like in the dog kennels, and it's like, oh, here's Bear, he's about to go out on tour, and whether you killed Bear or not.
I didn't pick up on that one. I mean, I picked up on when you go to the aquarium, that dog jumps on you. I forget that dog's name, but then that dog's with you through the entirety,
I think, yeah,
of the Abby section. But I didn't pick up on the Bear one. But yeah, there's and regardless of whether all those body bags are from Ellie or from Seraphites, your point still stands, Will, that they do a lot of throughout the Abby section. They do a lot of pointing at the murdering Ellie has done. Like they definitely do a lot of like, oh, look what Ellie did, and by association, you as the player did. They definitely call out a lot of the murdering you've done.
Yeah, I do think, even though I said earlier, I don't think that they do too much finger wagging at the player in this game. Thinking back to those early parts of the Abby section, I think they do kind of push that button a little bit.
Yeah, and part of it could be how you read it. I think I read it more as them attempting to, successfully or not, show that both sides of this conflict are doing bad things. That because a lot of times in video games, you play a protagonist, you play someone who's ostensibly a protagonist, and generally they're in the right, and everyone you're fighting's in the wrong. And I think I read it more as not so much about the player, but more about saying both Abby and Ellie's sides, they were trying to do this both sides thing of, hey, just because you're playing a character doesn't mean they aren't doing bad things. Like that doesn't mean they're always in the right. And now we're going to show you this other perspective, if that makes sense. And yeah, I guess different players can interpret whether they're pointing the finger at the player specifically. I think I interpreted it as that it was the commentary more on Ellie and not the player, if that makes sense.
And I think it's pretty easy in this case to wash your hands of it as the player, because they give Ellie such strong motivation that you're just like, well, that's just what she wants to do. I mean,
yeah, like I never felt like I was Ellie, so to speak. I don't know what that says about me, but yeah, as I said earlier, this was a linear story, and I think they were
You're
showing.
A monster.
I'm a monster. So the end of the Ellie section.
Yeah,
let's talk about that.
Yeah, you stab a pregnant lady.
It's pretty brutal.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the name of the guy who gets shot in the face, but that was really quick. He went out quick.
Oh yeah,
in the theater.
God, what was his name?
Oh, Jesse.
Jesse, that's right.
Yeah, okay.
Jesse.
He just runs right out and gets creamed, man.
I actually, that was something in this game that that was probably one of the main ones, but I think multiple times this game just like something would happen really quick, and it's like, whoa.
Especially when the sort of main cast come into conflict, like the two sides of the main cast come into conflict, things get like really intense and like there are like meaningful consequences to those conflicts. Whereas in you could see the case where they would be like, oh, the two main sides come into conflict and they fight, but nobody gets hurt. Like then they run away, kind of thing. That would be an easy thing to do that a lot of stories would do, and a lot of they don't shy away from that.
Yeah, a lot of video games in particular will do this like prolonged standoff thing,
right?
But
where they want the main characters to clash, but they don't want anybody to actually die from it. But this game doesn't do that. Yeah, Jesse just runs out and gets shot in the face by Abby, who is I guess she finally figures out what's going on.
Angry is the word you're looking for.
She's very angry. She figures out that Ellie's come after her, or that people from
and she's like, you murdered all my friends.
Yes, that's exactly what she says.
Yeah.
And
to me, that was one of this game has great performances throughout, but I thought that performance by Abby in particular, was really powerful. Of just like she had that line of like, we let you go, referring to because Ellie was there when Joel died, so she's referring to
Ellie and Tommy. Yeah,
and she's like, we let you go and you wasted it.
Abby lets her go twice, and she quote unquote wastes it.
Yeah. We'll get more to that later. Yeah, that's the whole thing, but yeah,
you have this really high intensity conflict where Abby finds Ellie and Dina and Tommy holed up in that theater and kills Jesse, and then it just cuts.
Yeah. So this is, I think, one of the most like brazen, audacious things they could have done is like you get to this climax. You've been playing for 10, 15 hours at this point. You've been hunting Abby. You get to the confrontation. Jesse just gets immediately offed, and like you're having this literal stare down between Abby and Ellie, and then cut to black.
And we go back 3 days.
Big letters, Seattle, day one.
Yeah. It's wild.
Like, yeah, I actually like that, like reignited me a little bit. Like I think towards the end of Ellie's section, I was like, all right, like kind of, you're just kind of going through the motions, wanting to see where the story goes. But I think like that kind of reignited me in a way of like, okay, like we're going back, we're playing as Abby now. We're going to presumably work back up to that same moment, seeing Abby's side of the story.
Yeah. Right. And and they really do some things that are kind of powerful in terms of, first of all, of course, seeing that compound, because I think you don't even realize that something could be that organized in this world. It almost looks like, I guess the right word for it, even though it is very, even though it does seem very like regimented and disciplined, it also seems civilized in a way. And so, and I guess, you hadn't seen anything that looked civilized since like Jackson. And even that was, was a little rough. They're like going out on all these patrols and they have to worry about zombies coming in, or not zombies, but whatever you call them, coming in. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning, and this may of course say something about me. I guess first of all, the physique. All right. I don't know that we necessarily need to talk about that, but first of all, I guess when I first saw it, I was like, holy shit. Like this girl is a freaking monster.
Abby's cut.
And at first I was like,
she's
goodness, but then of course I was thinking to myself, I was like, you wouldn't see that physique outside of like a bodybuilder. And then, but then of course, in all of your other games where you've got male characters, they look like bodybuilders.
Right.
And so I'm like, well, so William, why are you having this reaction? But then I also think that the fact that she's big and the game makes her, like, there are certain scenes that kind of show you how powerful she is. I mean, first of all, she chokes out everybody instead of stabbing them, which takes a bit more strength.
Yeah.
But there's this one scene where you fall through the floor in this sort of Chinese looking shop, like an Asian shop. And as soon as you fall through the floor, an enemy runs at you. And Abby just grabs them by the face and slams their head into the wall. And that was one of these things. I'm like, okay, this is a different animal that I'm controlling right now. This is not like a sneaky, stealthy, this is a behemoth, Another fun thing, I think, and this is me reading into it. I don't know if any of our millions of listeners are going to pick up this point, but like, I actually looked up who this model was. I was like, who do they model this body after? And I found this sort of CrossFit athlete.
Yeah.
And one of the things I noticed, and I think I mentioned this in our general channel, is that one of her idle animations, and it repeated a number of times, had her rolling her right shoulder and rubbing it with her arm. And I thought it was so fascinating that when I looked it up, the actual CrossFit athlete had a shoulder injury. And so it was like a long recurring shoulder injury. And so to me, it's this really interesting blend of like, the mocap performer, like their life blending into this other role, and I don't know, to me, it was just, I found it really fascinating. But those were some of my thoughts about I guess when I initially started controlling Abby and moving through the world with that character.
Yeah. Yeah, dude, she's brutal. She's
Abby is a freaking beast.
Yeah, she's super strong, and they show you that many, many times, and I think it's cool.
They established that quickly, that she is just a physical beast, and I like what you said, Willa. They really show a lot of contrast right up front of. One, what we're talking about right now is Abby is a very different character than Ellie. Ellie slinks around, relies on stealth a lot, has the knife. And Abby is, Ellie's kind of scrawny, for lack of a better word. Like she's definitely strong, or Ellie is, but she's like Abby, they very clearly drive home very quickly that like, no, she just has a physical presence, and even her friends around her comment on it as well, of just like how strong she is. But then also the wolf compound that you were talking about, Will, is a very distinct or different place from Jackson, and like through all of the first Last of Us and the first half of this game, like I don't know about you guys, but for me, it got to where it was kind of hard to imagine anything bigger than just like these little scrappy pockets of human civilization. So like seeing the wolves compound was like, oh, like no, they've really like built up this infrastructure, and they are very militant by nature,
right?
And like,
and that's the thing is you kind of know at that point that the only reason they're able to have that kind of society is by being a militaristic organization that just does not deal with dissension or they're not gonna really worry about other people needing resources. They're gonna take what they want.
Yes, they definitely do. I mean, and the character, Abby is ripped partially because like they train like soldiers, like they are. It is demanded of them that they stay physically fit and capable soldiers.
Yeah, and I think part of her psychology is revealed a little bit there too. There are times where, God, I wish I knew these characters' names like the back of my hand, but the guy who hangs out and basically sets up shop in the aquarium, there are times when they're spending time together. What's his name?
Owen.
Oh, yeah. So when they're hanging out together, there are times where he's like, "Why don't you just like stay here and hang out in my little cool hut?" And she's like, "I got to go back and train. I got to go back and train." And there are a couple times she mentions that in the course of the game, and it's like, this girl's got to get big. She's got to go lift, Owen. She can't be sitting here smooching with you.
Yeah. I think it was a really good contrast because I mean, this game, I think a lot about the contrast between the two sides. And I think it played, like, we kind of mentioned this when we were talking about like mechanics, but like right from the jump, like they're like, no, like this is going to be a more action packed segment. Like when you're playing as Abby, like you go in more guns blazing, you get more physical, like
they give you an automatic weapon.
Yeah. I mean, you start off with getting better guns than anything Ellie had access to, and just like walking past barrels of ammo, and you're just like, oh, just refill your ammo here and keep shooting at these targets. We got plenty. I don't know.
Yeah. So like that to me was a really big contrast. And I was like, all right, let's go.
Yeah.
How did you like, because we get a whole slew of new characters introduced. We get Owen, we get Meg, I think was the other woman, the pregnant woman.
Mel.
Okay, yeah.
Yep.
And what was
there was
Abby?
Nora, and there was one other guy.
Yeah, I think we're trying to think of the same guy's name. He's the one name I can't remember.
Yeah, I can't remember his name either. Hold on, I'm looking it up.
He's kind of like
not Manny.
Manny, yeah. That's who I was thinking of.
Yeah, same here. So yeah, we get all those characters kind of introduced pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But I think they did a pretty good job of like kind of establishing their characters, and I also think making them, for me, like fairly, at least in the grand scheme of as likable as any Last of Us character is, I guess, in this world of murder. Like they were all likable characters, I found.
Yeah. I like that cast of characters that are in Abby's section, I think, and then they introduce a few more later on when she gets mixed up with some Seraphites. And I think that like my overall read on the Abby stretch versus the Ellie stretch is like we get to see, like you were talking about contrast, we get to see Ellie sort of transition in the player's view from the default hero to maybe she's the baddie and then we get the inverse of Abby, where we start off as her knowing she's killed Joel, and seeing that she's part of this militaristic organization that we don't have any good positive associations with, and she kind of is able to move from the default villain to a more human character. And so I think those two transitions work really well in contrast to each other.
Yeah, and I think in the long run, I probably ended up with a little more sympathy for Abby than I did for Ellie.
Oh, absolutely. I like Abby way more than Ellie.
Yeah. I mean, Abby obviously did. I mean, everyone in this game did bad things.
Yeah, nobody's hands are clean, so you're judging them based on what you got, and Abby is a way better, more likable person to me than Ellie by the end of the game, at least.
Yes, agree with definitely by the end of the game.
Yes.
And I was hedging because I want to make it clear that all of these characters are bad people. Like none of their hands are clean. But yes, in the relative scheme of things, Abby is to me a much more likable, sympathetic character than Ellie.
Yes.
And the core in my mind. All right. So in my mind, like before we get to the end segment, the Abby section is defined by two things. One, really freaking kick-ass set pieces, and two, the two Seraphites whose names I forget that she travels with. Either of you remember their names?
Lev,
yes,
and Yara.
Yes,
that sounds right.
The budding relationship with those two, I think, is the real narrative, core of Abby's section. And when I first ran into them, I was like, "What are like?" Let's get back to. We need to get back to because the whole game up to that point had been this Abby Ellie conflict.
Yeah,
and
I struggled with that a lot.
Yeah, the first so many hours of the Yara and Lev story, I was like, why are we spending so much time on this? Like, we need to get back to what's going on in the main plot. But by the end, I found the whole Yara Lev thing to be very important and critical part of Abby's development, and one of the most important, in my mind, they're two of the most important characters in this game.
Yeah, I think they're evidence. I think the Seraphites are evidence that Abby can evolve in a way that Ellie cannot. And,
exactly.
I think one thing that I do recall about that section, that when you first actually encounter the encampments, the Seraphite encampments, I found myself really, really not wanting to murder any of the Seraphites. Yeah. But I couldn't get through the encounter. I couldn't find a way to sneak through without alerting them. And so eventually I had to murder them. And that felt really bad to me. And I don't know if that's probably just a William thing. That's probably, but I really wanted to get through that encounter without killing anybody, and I couldn't. And
there were definitely encounters in especially later that we haven't quite gotten to yet against Seraphites where I was like, I don't want to fight these people. I just want to move to the next area.
Yeah. But it was very difficult to do so. And then of course, and I don't know if we want to get to this next, but the other thing I kind of want to call attention to, the other encounter was the Abby fighting Ellie in the chains. There were chains hanging from the wall, and Ellie has all of her guns, and Abby's just trying to run around and fight her with her hands and stuff. I really did not like that encounter, just because it seemed. Go ahead.
Was that back in the theater at the end?
Yeah. When they get back to the final actual confrontation is what he's talking about.
Yeah. So that's still technically, I think, in section 3, but I don't know if we want to go that far ahead yet. But that was the only other thing I want to talk about in this section. So, but yeah,
no, I think that's fair.
Yeah, this section, to me, this is the most the busiest section. I feel like Abby's section has a lot going on in it, but.
Yeah, in a way that almost detracted for me. It felt a little stitched together and kind of all over the place as I was playing through it. Looking back on it, I can see why they chose to include the stuff they did during Abby's section, but I really did struggle, like you were saying, with we get up to that climactic encounter and then it rolls the time back and then we're just doing all this random stuff that I in the moment just didn't care about.
Yeah, I think there is some pacing or tone setting or something they could have done better there, because I think Yara and Lev absolutely needed to be in the game. They're a key piece. I think something in getting me on board with them up front could have been a little better. Like, I don't know if it's as simple as just signaling like, hey, look, get prepared for the long haul. Like, we're not going to get back to that climax moment quickly. Like, just kind of maybe knowing that it was going to be a little bit longer of a stretch
which we should have known because they rolled the clock back 3 days. Like, but for still me, like, I just couldn't get out of that headspace, and it really did sour a lot of the Abby stuff for me. Other than like the cool set pieces, I really didn't enjoy playing through the Abby section. Because I was just like guns blazing, like, get me back to that confrontation. This is what I want to see. Yeah. And then after the fact, looking back, I'm like, okay, that stuff was important, but it just didn't grab me in the moment.
Yeah, I struggled right up front to get on board, but I think I made the transition fairly quickly after that, because once I did, like, I think overall I enjoyed Abby's section more than Ellie's. And yeah, let's just go ahead and we don't have to go in depth, but just list out some of these set pieces because they're wild. Like, we already mentioned my favorite set piece, which was that apartment complex where, like, after you've been like crossing rooftops and you have to go down this apartment complex and it's just like blown out through the middle and you're like just having to like slink your way down around the edges, and there are just so many infected enemies, and it's just
they've been there so long that some of them are like jammed into the wall and they have to crack loose. I love that. I love that part of the game.
Yeah, and it's just this really intense, like to me, that's oftentimes when this game is at its best, is when it like throws you into these really long, gnarly, intense, like intricate set pieces that you slowly work your way through. And it's just like, you're just kind of in the shit. Like, you're really just having to buckle down and get through it. And like, that scene was the best of those to me, because you're really just the way the environment's designed and the way you're moving through it, and then just all the atmosphere and the tone of it, I thought was just really striking.
Two other scenes that I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't touch on, and these just came to my mind as we're talking about this. One is, there's a scene where Abby boosts, I think, the two, the guy and the girl, up through the top of a window, and then the door is locked behind her and she can't get out. And it's a really, really brutal combat encounter. And the whole time you're doing it, like, you're like, Lev, guys, and you're really like, oh God, I mean, are they gonna really, because they have plenty of reasons to not like Abby, you know what I mean? And it's like, are they gonna really come back in here and save me?
Such a great infusion of narrative into that combat scenario, because you are wondering from Abby's perspective, like, are they going to leave me?
Are they going to come back?
And yet there between them at that point, like, there's a lot of question marks.
Right. And the other piece, of course, is when Abby basically almost gets hung in the rain. We didn't really mention that, but that is a really, really, really intense scene. She's like having a bad time.
Abby goes through some stuff.
It's rough, man. But
that scene, the whole like framing and cinematic nature of that scene was really impressive to me.
I thought so too.
But, I do think that scene was really intense, but I do have to say that, like, the buildup of the Seraphites did nothing for me, and like for some reason, I think I've just gotten to the point now where, like, I'm playing a video game and they're like, guess what, guys? There's a crazy religious cult and they hang and disembowel people, and like, I'm just like, okay, I'm tired of this. Can we do something else? Anything else? Like, I don't need this enemy group anymore.
It's interesting. We all have our own little kind of idiosyncrasies. I think sometimes I almost overlook into this idea that, like, I'm playing the character and I'm doing what they're doing. Whereas, in a very real sense, Flex is right that, we're on a roller coaster, and then, of course, Nate, hates and has no sympathy for the Seraphite. So, I mean, we all have our things. Anyway.
But let me shout out 2 more set pieces, and then I want to get back to the Seraphites. So, and these other 2, I think, are in a way kind of dumb and silly, but also I think I really appreciate how just ridiculous they were willing to go throughout Abby's section, and like just really get wild with it. So the first one is the Resident Evil Hospital, where you go down in the basement and you fight this, like, they have the slow build up of like, there's clear foreshadowing that there's some giant monster that you're going to have to fight.
That place was awesome. I love that place.
Yeah, it's just, you just have this like hour, maybe even longer scene of just like building up to, there's some ridiculous monster. And of course you get there and it is this very Resident Evil-y, like just monstrosity. And that whole scene was just wild. It was, and then the other one, which kind of ties back into the Seraphites, is near the very end of Abby's section when the wolves invade the, you go to the Seraphite Island and the wolves end up invading, and the stuff starts getting set on fire. And it was just like, it's this, like, I feel like in some ways the whole game has like, you just keep seeing this escalating back and forth violence. And like, as the Seraphites get introduced as yet another group, we already talked a little bit about how you had Fedra and then the wolves came over and now they're fighting with the Seraphites, and just all of these power struggles and just constant conflict and fighting. And it feels to me like the wolf and Seraphite encounter just kept ramping up in absurdity until that final scene. And I was just laughing at the absurdity of it all when you finally get that final set piece and you're riding through this burning thing this burning village on horseback. You get knocked down. You're like having
that giant black guy who's going to mess you up, man.
Yeah. You have this like fist fight with that guy, like on the beach as everything's crumbling around you. Like it gets to just such absurd levels that like, it's just this wild.
Yeah. I also think it's worth mentioning the time where basically, I can't remember the leader, whatever the leader is of the wolves, Abby encounters him like out in the woods. Yeah. And basically that's kind of an interesting, tense kind of standoff there because he's like, what are you doing? Come on. And she's like,
yeah,
these are my little Seraphite homies,
yeah.
But anyway, yeah, I thought that was an interesting.
And then he gets shot in the back by Yara, who was on the ground, basically already dead. And then the Abby and Lev run away, and you just get this like half-second shot of them just filling Yara with bullets. It was so brutal.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the main thing, the one thing left I really want to talk about a little bit more in this section is that developing relationship Abby has with Yara and Lev. And to me, the important part, we've kind of already touched on it, is it shows a lot of growth on Abby's part of she finds these people that are, have been the enemy before, in her eyes. And she comes to kind of, this is one of the main themes of the game is kind of like different perspectives, different sides and whatever. And Abby kind of goes through this growth where she gets to understand Yara and Lev and where they come from and kind of opens up to them. And we see a lot of growth in Abby of coming to accept people who were at one point she viewed as different from her, if that makes sense. And that developing relationship worked for me a lot. And Lev is awesome. Lev is one of the best characters in the game.
Yeah, I like Lev a lot.
Yeah. When they were the whole bit with Lev giving Abby crap for her fear of heights was very precious. But yeah, I don't know if any of you have anything more to add kind of around the Seraphites or Yara, Lev, or I guess really anything in Abby's section before we kind of get back to when Abby does return back to Ellie and we get back to that conflict.
I think you covered it pretty well, man.
Yeah, let's move ahead.
Yeah, then eventually we go back through all 3 days of Seattle and again is from Abby's perspective and have Will's favorite fight in the game where we do post Jesse getting very quickly shot in the face. A fight actually does ensue then, and interestingly, you control Abby during the pivotal Abby-Ellie showdown. And Ellie has all of her stealth tricks and has like this weirdly elaborate like maze setup where she's employing all the stuff that you used to use. She's setting up bombs, she's throwing smoke grenades, she's, doing all that stuff. And you're kind of having to hunt her down. I actually also found that fight really frustrating.
It was not fun.
And I think part of it is that for most of the game, the stealth binary kind of works pretty well. Like, it doesn't have the most elaborate system. It seems like it doesn't have the most elaborate stealth system, but it doesn't really need it. Where there are some games where you've got like really, really complex awareness meters and stuff like that. But for some reason in that fight with Ellie, it very much seemed to me that I had no clue like when and how I was going to get detected. There were some times where, I felt like sure that she was like staring right at me, but she wouldn't see me. And there were other times that I felt like there was no way she knew where I was, but then she would see me. And she's so fast that she would just like blast you, and then, even, and once she kind of saw you and kind of keyed in on you, it seemed like it was very hard to get away at certain points too. So I just found that fight to be just kind of, irritating. Basically.
I agree. But then at the end of the fight, we get kind of, to me, in my opinion, in my reading of the game, we get the moment that redeems Abby and kind of completes her transformative arc of, she started the game of seeking revenge for Joel. Like she was the first person seeking revenge. She got her revenge on Joel. Then Ellie murders her friends. Then that kind of sets Abby back off of like, oh, I got to get revenge for them again, and kind of this back and forth. But, Abby does get the upper hand in this fight, and she basically holds both Ellie and Dina's lives in her hands, and she has the opportunity to kill them. And
she very clearly would have without Lev.
Yes. And that's where I was about to pivot to, is that's a lot of the importance of the whole Yara Lev arc is it's kind of through them and only with them, but still through them that Abby kind of learned to let go of her, whatever you want to call it, her anger, her need for revenge, whatever, like kind of that part of herself that had been driving her for so long, like you Lev is kind of the embodiment of like the growth she has gone through, but with Lev's help, obviously. So I think that was kind of to me, that's kind of like the wrapping of Abby, so to speak. And like in the parts after this, in my opinion, we see Abby in like a much more positive light. Like she just seems to be happier with life in general, because like the game does go on after this, and like she just seems to have found a good place.
Exactly. Yeah. I think you see that very stark moment when she basically beats Ellie into submission.
Yeah.
and then Dina runs in from off screen and gets, I think, taken down by Lev with an arrow, but not killed. And Abby is ready to basically slit her throat, and Ellie's like, she's pregnant, don't do it. And Abby says good, and is like about to slit her throat. It's really, really dark.
Yes.
But then Lev stops Abby at the last second. And then they just kind of move on from that, and then we move into sort of the epilogue. So
so so then there's this whole which this is part of where like the game just kind of keeps going, but there's a whole epilogue scene after this where we jump ahead in time a little bit. Ellie and Dina Dina has had her kid, and this kid's, I don't know how old at this point, like a couple of years maybe.
Not that old.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, at least a few months.
Mm-hmm. All right. We are going to take a quick break, actually. Sorry, getting some chatter in the chat.
Yeah, we'll take a quick break before we jump into the final stuff.
Yep. And then we'll talk about kind of the last little chunk of the game, and then we'll wrap up. So bear with us. Stick around. We will be right back after a short break. And we are back with our ATACS pod episode on The Last of Us Part 2. I'm Flex, joined by Nate and Will, and we are in the home stretch of this deep dive into The Last of Us Part 2. We were just transitioning to kind of like the final stretch. We were setting it up, explaining there's a time jump after that Ellie and Abby confrontation.
Yeah.
Where we get to see...
You get to see farm life.
Yeah, we get to see Ellie and Dina on a farm. They got a kid. You get to herd some sheep or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ellie has her PTSD breakdown.
Yep.
To further drive home that she is not in a good way.
Yeah. It's a pretty heartbreaking sequence, all things considered. Like, you see the possibility for a normal-ish family life for Ellie, and then she's just incapable of having that, basically.
And it's a difficult thing, I think, because, you know, it's taken people a long time to learn how to treat trauma.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think probably most of your modern approaches to trauma, probably, you know, even in the 90s, you know what I mean? Your approaches to trauma were a lot of times having the person who was traumatized kind of retelling the incident.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and only later have we gotten into things like, you know, EMDR, which is like eye movement and desensitization and, you know, embodied approaches. And so, you know, if you imagine someone who's experiencing extreme PTSD and they have no idea how they're supposed to deal with it,
right?
You know, like
they have no resources available to them.
Right. I mean, it seems almost like, to me, it's like, well, I guess that's logical. I mean, if she can't sleep, if she multiple times a day is having flashbacks, you know, what else? What would be the first thing you would come up with to try and deal with what you were experiencing? You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when we were talking earlier about how Ellie just has been totally broken down, like she is a broken person. Like, this is, to me, kind of drilling that home even more.
Yeah, that's where this really comes to a head. I feel like it's like, even once she's left the mission she had behind, she has this family, she has, you know, daily responsibilities, she has all the things she needs, but it's still just this lingering thing she cannot escape.
I think by this time in the game, and this has really been one of the more interesting things about this game to me, is that, you know, when you're playing as Ellie in this last section, it was almost I really felt such a disconnect between, you know, what I wanted to do and what the character's actions were.
Yeah.
That I found myself having kind of a running commentary, like, you know, where are we going now, idiot? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to do, dummy? You know, and I was just not happy with any action that she was taking.
Yeah.
But that's it's kind of a rare thing. I mean, I don't know that I really play that many games where I'm like, spending, hours just doing things that I think are ridiculous, which is kind of where I was towards the end of the game with her.
Yeah, I think it's a real risk for them to put you in the position of basically controlling Ellie and watching her dismantle her chance for a happy life.
But to me, I also felt shades of Joel again in I had that reaction Will was talking about of like disagreeing with the character I'm playing's choices. I felt the same thing at the end of the first Last of Us when Joel went on his murderous rampage at the end of the game, and kind of coming back to what I was talking about before of kind of my thesis of the game is like Joel was kind of Ellie's main parental figure, and I feel like a lot of how she's learned how to interact with the world came from him, and we kind of see that mirrored in her late game sprint again, is like Joel at the end of the first game and Ellie at the end of this game, both of them were just on that, just blinders on, like just so focused on the one thing they were going to do, and just like on this nonsensical murderous rampage. And like that to me is just how they have learned to interact with the world. And we don't, as Will was talking about, like we don't have mental health doctors in this world. Like there's no real out for, I mean, so in that way I feel really bad for Ellie, because like she's not getting the help she needs, but like that is where unfortunately her life has taken her, is like that's really the only course of action she knows how to take in this world. And I also feel really bad for Dina, because like that whole like Dina had kind of moved on and was
trying to help Ellie move on.
Yeah. And it's hard because I can't help but feel, and maybe this is misplaced, but I can't help but feel that, Ellie could have tried harder to find a different solution, and I think that informed a lot of my emotion, and I don't know how far ahead we're moving or how fast we're moving there, but
I mean, I think at this point we can talk about anything.
Yeah. When she comes back and the home is empty, there was a part of me, and I don't know, I think I'm just an emotional fella, but I was watching her walk up and I was like, oh, let's hope it's empty. I hope it's gone. I hope she is gone. And then we walked in, it was empty. I was like, awesome. Perfect. And then, Ellie's walking around all sad and I'm like, eat it up. Eat it up. Look what, I was like so enraged at her, especially after the whole final showdown scene, cause that happens after that final showdown. And there was a part where, I initially, I think when the first time I started that fight scene, like I was so disinterested and irritated about having to even do that I just sort of like stood there for a second and like just let her beat the crap out of me. And then she finally broke my neck and I was like, I wanted the game to end there. I was like,
that would have been a good choice, honestly.
I was like, I want the game to end with Ellie getting her dumb neck broke and then Abby and Lev getting out of here. Like, I mean, but the game was like, no, you got to keep fighting because you got to be victorious as Ellie, so she can just and it'll do nothing for her PTSD. But anyway,
I'm with you.
I had some emotional pieces there at the end.
Though I do like. I mean, I felt the same way that Ellie was making all the wrong choices, especially there at the end. But I keep coming back to, like, I legitimately do not think she was capable of making any other choice. Like, I think her character, like where she was, like she almost, I feel like she almost wasn't even making choices. She was just kind of on autopilot. Like that's just how broken down she had gotten as a person.
Yeah. That was the sense I got too, for sure.
I guess the tough part of it though is if we say, and this is getting into something far beyond the game, but if we say that someone doesn't, due to having a certain type of upbringing and a certain type of parent or a certain type of parental figure, that they in effect don't have choices. What I think that's a very dangerous slope.
Yes.
And I think, and maybe that's part of, and especially, and of course I'm going to react to everything emotional because I'm an emotional baby, but that's kind of, sometimes I feel like that's what my job is. I'm a therapist. And so I feel like a lot of time I'm trying to fix parental mistakes,
Right.
And so, and I guess so if we say that because some of these people were like maybe, abused by their parents physically or verbally or emotionally, that they're doomed to have a certain type of life or to make
Yeah.
certain types of choices. I think it's just, it's maybe too much for me to bear. It's too much for me to handle.
Yeah. And I don't think I come down on like, oh, there was no choice at all being made by, like, she was making the choice to stay with Dina and live on the farmhouse for as long as she continued to make that choice. But I think the inertia of her life was so like in the direction of violence and revenge that it only took a little nudge.
It only took that guy coming and showing
Tommy
her that
showing up
Yeah.
and egging her on to push her in that direction, whereas it took her making the constant choice, the constant effort to stay a peaceful life every day, but
Right.
just like the tiniest nudge set her off on the warpath.
Yeah.
Right. So like an erosion of her willpower, maybe.
Right.
Over time.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Will. I don't mean to say that she had absolutely no choice, but I think Nate put it more eloquently than I did, of like kind of where her life, or the momentum of her life and her mental state it's much harder for her to make the other one choice than another. Another
Right.
thing that, so I actually really emotionally welled up at the end of this game. And I think one aspect of Ellie's life that it was one of the, because there was like, they threw in one final Joel flashback there at the end. And I think what that ended up really driving home for me is Ellie. We've talked a lot about like the, Joel's influence, which I think he was a big influence. And if like talking about parental figures, the one time we get the flashback with Abby and see her dad, he's a very positive person.
Right.
He's actually very starkly contrasted with Joel. And I think that maybe bears out a little bit in how Abby's able to bounce back. But there's a very unique and I think important part of Ellie's character, which is that she still, throughout both of these games, is the only person we've ever known to be immune to the virus. And she knew that, and she knew there was a chance for a cure based on her.
Yeah.
And at this point, she has learned, through those flashbacks, she learned from Joel that Joel basically denied her of that chance to be a cure.
Right.
And she had gone through a good chunk, she went through a good chunk of time thinking like this was her life's purpose, so to speak. And that was kind of taken from her. So I think there's also this big element of like, what does her life mean now? Like she had this huge, important, like monumental thing that was kind of her purpose in life, that like was really bringing her a lot of meaning, I think, and like really do good for the world, like monumental, like history altering good for the world potentially. And like for that to be kind of taken from her against her will, like I think that would also be very damaging, and like kind of like really losing I think what made me really sad at the end of the game is just seeing Ellie as someone who just really lost that sense of purpose and self, and like just like what does she do with her life at that point? Like that to me, more than losing Joel, hit me as a really hard mental thing to overcome, because like we talked about how she clashed with Joel. Like that relationship wasn't perfect. Like people lose parental figures or people they're close with all the time, but like that kind of more bigger existential, whatever you kind of want to call it, like reason for living was kind of.
And, I definitely take that point about the father. I think that's important that you called to the fact that, that father was a much different person. Abby's father was a much different person. Although I do think it's interesting to me that like Owen, he sort of almost like decided on his own volition. And of course, we don't know anything about his upbringing, but he decides to try and basically go completely out of the cycle. He mentions, he's like, I'm tired of this garbage. Like we're just fighting these people and then we're getting pulled back and then there are more dead people and then there's more. And he's like, I'm just going to go hang out in this aquarium and do my own damn thing because this sucks, And so I think it's interesting, like that the game provides an example of someone who, and of course he's still caught in the crossfire. You know what I mean? He can't completely escape it, but he really gives it a shot. And I mean, of course, I would argue that at the end, the purpose, if Ellie needed a purpose, I mean, raising a child with Dina, I mean, that's one of the things. Like when you have a child, there's a big dose of maybe my life is not quite as pleasurable as it used to be, but there's a giant dose of meaning, and I think that meaning piece is really, I mean, to me, it's right there for the taking if she wanted it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it would have been great if she had taken the choice to just live the family life with Dina, and that's why it was so heartbreaking that she did not do that.
Yeah, and the end piece there, of course, I agree, Flex. It was pretty sad when she basically talks about how, he's like, "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" And she's like, I'll try. I'm willing to try. I think there's something like that. Is that
something like that? Yeah,
I think I remember something.
Yeah, that's the final scene. I think that really drove home, like just how important that was, like how upset she was over what Joel did, and like ripped that choice away from her.
Right.
But how he was still a very important part of her life, and she wanted to, continue that relationship forward in whatever way they were able to.
And then she lost that.
And then he got taken away from her.
Yeah. So I mean, she
Abby.
kind of this double whammy of like really big losses, so to speak. Yeah. And did y'all, in that final encounter, did you think both going into it, did you think both Abby and Ellie would come out alive? I was kind of surprised that neither of them died, to be honest.
Yeah, I was definitely surprised that neither.
I guess I really didn't know what to expect.
Yeah, like going into it, I was convinced Ellie was so far down that path that she was not going to leave that without one of them dying. Like that's kind of where I was at.
I feel like such a reactionary or something. Not a reactionary, that's not the right word, but just such a quick panicky response. I don't know. Now I'm recalling the fact that at the very end, of course, she gets her fingers all jacked up in that fight with Abby, and then she goes back and tries to play her song and butchers it, and I'm like, and while I'm watching her do that, I'm like, can't play your tune. What a shame.
Yeah.
They really drill home that whole, if I ever lose you, I'll lose myself. Refrain that was the song her and Joel sang, and
right.
She physically lost herself. She lost part of her fingers, and then couldn't play guitar anymore because she lost that.
Yeah, we're a little heavy-handed on that one.
I don't know that I picked up on that. That's I guess maybe if you're smarter than me, you pick up on that.
Well, they definitely play that song multiple times.
Okay, yeah.
Of the "If I Ever Lose You."
Yeah, I think my eyes glazed over during that prolonged intro, and so probably I didn't pick up on it.
So I think this gets into the kind of remaining thing I wanted to wrap up on is, there's that whole refrain, if I ever lose you, I'll lose myself. And that's, to me, kind of the on the nose thing of, Ellie lost Joel, in the process kind of lost herself in seeking revenge. And there's been a whole lot of talk about this game of like, oh, cycles of revenge are bad, and all this stuff. And there's been kind of a lot of, or at least I've read a lot of, I'll say negative critiques of this game as being a very simple cycles of revenge is bad kind of story. And I guess kind of to wrap up our final thoughts of the game, like, is that kind of how you see this story as a whole, or do you think there's more to it than that? And whichever way you see it, like, did you enjoy the story overall? Like, do you think you got something from it, or like kind of give us your wrap up picture, I guess, if that's, I feel like I just threw a lot at you, but, and I can start if y'all need a second to think.
Sure, you go ahead. Yeah.
I think to me, I view that the cycle of revenge is bad narrative as a little reductive is maybe the word I'd use. I think, like, I can see how people would read the game that way, but I feel like there's more nuance to it than that, even if it is just kind of dissecting the different characters and their mental states or personalities and how they got to that point. But I think even if like the underpinnings, like, yes, if you take the big picture structure, you see cycles of violence on both a macro and a micro scale. You see it on the macro scale with Fedra and the wolves and the Seraphites and just all those conflicts that never end. And you see it on the micro scale in the interpersonal conflicts of Abby kills Joel, so then Ellie wants revenge and kills Abby's friends, and then Abby comes back after Ellie for that, and then, Ellie can't let it go and comes back one more time, and, you get that back and forth. But I think for me, I want to give the story more credit, and I think it does earn, I don't think it's perfect at everything, but I think it does earn more credit in portraying a world that's very clearly messed up. And you could even, as you do in art, you could even draw some parallels in that the ways that world's messed up to the real world in some ways, and it shows how different characters have gotten to the point they're at and how they deal with that world and their flaws and all. And I think it portrays some character studies that I found there being, for me, value in seeing through and just kind of thinking through and their situations. And I mean, it's a brutal story. It's a downer. Like, there's really nothing positive in it. Like, it's a whole lot of murdering for sure. But I do think for me, like, kind of the individual character studies set against the backdrop of a world that I think they flesh out very well. Yes, it's hyper violent and, maybe unrealistic in that way. A lot of the counter arguments I've seen is like, this is an unrealistically violent portrayal of how society would devolve in, if there was an outbreak like that. Which I think that read of it is maybe just discrediting the entire game from the jump. So maybe there has to be that mental leap of like, okay, the world has gotten to this bad of a state and people have been that horrible to each other to get to this point. Like, maybe you have to be able to make the mental leap to say like, okay, we've gotten to this point, whether that's believable that we would get to that point or not. Like, we are here. And that's kind of how I read the game. I think it's like, we are there, whether people are that crappy and would have gotten to that point or not. I don't know. That's not really, I don't feel like my place to kind of make that determination, so to speak. But I think from that starting point, the story did present interesting character studies that I found worth seeing through. And I quite enjoyed it. I think there were a couple of flaws that we did talk about. I think they didn't quite elaborate on Ellie's transformation, so to speak, from the first game to this game quite well enough. And maybe some of the story beats and transitioning to the Seraphites also not as smooth as it could have been. So, some things like that, but overall, I still enjoyed it quite a bit. That was a large ramble, so I will pass the mic, whichever one of you wants to go next.
What you think, Nate? You want to go? Or you want me to go?
Go ahead.
Well, I guess to me, the broad strokes of the story, I wasn't quite as impressed with. It's almost like, um, I guess it's almost like on the macro level, I wasn't tremendously impressed with the story, but on the micro level, in terms of the some of the interactions and some of the dialogue, I liked all the components, but I'm not sure I liked how it all kind of came together. I think maybe there was some way to put all these little pieces together, at least from the story side, that I think might have been more impactful. But in terms of like the voice acting and the mannerisms of the characters, and the dialogue, I think, a lot of those things I did like. And of course, I just, The Last of Us is kind of a singular thing for me in terms of combining a lot of things that I really like. I really like environmental storytelling. I really like post-apocalyptic worlds. I really like scrounging. I really like stealth gameplay. You know, so it combined a lot of kind of gameplay and environmental setting pieces that really, really appeal to me. So, I certainly felt like I got something out of it, and I felt like there was a real artistic brush at work in constructing some of these encounters and interactions. But just as a whole, I think some of those pieces didn't quite jive together for me. But it still remains one of my favorite games I've played this year, and I'd imagine if I wrote a top 10 list, it'd probably be on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree with both of y'all on a lot of those points. Obviously, this game is a very well-produced product. I think a lot of the fundamentals are really astounding in terms of visuals, audio design, gameplay mechanics, basic feedback. All that stuff is just extremely well honed. And then in terms of the narrative, I agree with you, Will, that I don't think the large scale meta story necessarily worked for me as I was playing through it. I talked about how when I was playing the Abbey section, which is, at least a third of the game, I kind of just didn't really enjoy playing most of it. Like, I liked seeing some of the set piece moments. But I just, because of the way the larger story was structured, having that perspective switch in the middle, that climactic encounter, and I wasn't really interested in the Seraphites. I became interested in Lev and Yara as characters, but I didn't have any initial interest in the Seraphites, and so I struggled through that whole act of the game to just kind of enjoy engaging with what the game was giving me in the moment. And then that epilogue, I think, is widely criticized for kind of being like a feeling like let's dip into the well of, hey, violence and revenge are bad one too many times, which I can get that argument for sure. But I don't know. I think if you think about the game as like a big critique of violence, I think you could say, okay, yeah, it makes the point super early and then it just keeps hammering the point over and over and over. But I don't think that's, like, if I had to say this game is about something, I don't know that would necessarily be the one thing that I would say it's about. And I think they're doing so much in this game that I think trying to boil it down to just one topic is too reductive anyway. So I don't necessarily jive with that criticism all that much. I think they do right by their characters and showing the drives and motivations and the impacts of the violent world they inhabit. And I did enjoy that character level stuff a lot. Even if some of the structural parts of the story didn't work for me as I was playing it, getting the whole thing and then reflecting on it, there's a lot of good stuff there. So it's kind of a weird one for me because I play games to have fun and to enjoy them while I'm playing them. And I can't say that I 100% enjoyed or like got a lot out of the moment to moment playing through the game, but I am glad that I played it and feel like there's a lot narratively to chew on there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's a good point you make, that there's a lot. I think there's a lot going on in this game, and it's a game I thought about a lot after I finished it as well. Like, I think there's a lot to chew on. And I could, like, on some level, I get why it gets reduced to a more simple revenge story.
I mean, if you have to reduce it to something, I guess that's what you do, right?
Yeah. But I also think it's too hard to reduce to one thing. And personally, if I reduce it to one thing, I wouldn't even reduce it.
I think there are other viable options to talk about if you're going to make it about one thing, but
but it's certainly it's
an interesting one.
It's an interesting game. It's often messy and imperfect, but I feel like they swing for some stuff, and they hit sometimes, they don't hit sometimes. But I think it's a game I certainly appreciate for. I mean, this is from, a first party AAA studio, and like, this to me doesn't feel like a safe bet kind of game. Like,
I think that is a good point. It's not a safe play by Naughty Dog to release this as a sequel to The Last of Us.
Yeah. So like, I appreciate them going for it and like making a game that's interesting, if nothing else. Like, and I do think it's very interesting, and I think there's some neat stuff in it. And I enjoyed it even when it is messy and imperfect. And unless anyone has a quick closing comment, I think that's going to wrap up this podcast. This has been a very deep dive into The Last of Us Part 2 on this episode of ATACS. I have been Flex, joined by Nate and Will, and we are going to sign off, and I'm sure we'll be back to talk about more games later. So thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.